Good evening and welcome to GB Boxing and Fighting Irish. And tonight we have a very special presentation brought to us by Luke's Imagination or Luke's Brain, which is the basically the kind of unappreciated champions and the unappreciated boxers that really should be a lot more well known for what they've achieved and their boxing skills. So, as it's Luke's baby, I'm going to immediately hand it over to Luke to kick things off because something tells me this is going to be an absolute wonderful evening and loads of contributions. So let's kick it off straight away. Luke?
Okay, Grant. So yeah, as Enzo said, it's fighters we think are either underappreciated, underrated, or just aren't given props enough for what they may have achieved in their career, how good they were. They might not have exactly had the best achievements, but they might have been very great fighters that might have just missed the mark, or champions who are forgotten. And for me, my top five is champions who are mainly forgotten that don't get mentioned enough, in my opinion, amongst boxing conversations I might have. So I'm going to go from number 5 up to number 1. Now, number 5 was the hardest pick because there was a big long list of about 11 or 12 fighters who all deserved that number 5 spot. And I gave the number 5 spot to a person who actually passed away on Sunday, which was Eder Joffrey.
I took him out because I knew someone else was going to pick it after Sunday.
Yeah, that was no disrespect to himself or any of the other fighters, but that was what tipped it for me. I watched a good few clips of him Sunday night again, and I was like, yeah, he's going in. He was going to be in my honorable mentions, and he went up to my number 5. So, yeah. So I wrote notes down, by the way, so I'm not waffling on too much because I know we need to get through this as quick as we can. So,
it's just because he was so much,
Yeah, that's it. So, he was a bantamweight champion, first and foremost, highly regarded as one of the best bantamweights of all time. But you never really hear him mentioned. Now, to be honest, the best bantamweight I've seen since him is probably Naoya Inoue. I think he is on that level. And I'd love to get a time machine and put them two against one another because Eder Joffrey was an aggressive fighter. He came to fight. He stuck his head in your chest and he got to work. And he had a record of 72 wins and 2 losses. And he had a couple of draws as well. But I'll disregard the draws for this because the older fighters tend to have those. He was undisputed champion at bantamweight, and both of his losses were very, very, very controversial. They were both in Japan against a fighter called Fighting Harada. He lost his title against him in Tokyo in a very controversial decision. And then he had a rematch again in Tokyo and lost that too in a controversial decision. Then he retired, came back a couple of years later at featherweight. And he won the featherweight title then, the undisputed featherweight title. So he's a 2-weight world champion. He had an amazing style, very fan-friendly. I've only heard a couple of people mention him to me in conversation, so I don't think he's much appreciated anymore. And I think he's someone that definitely is worth giving a look to, especially if you like the lighter fighters. It's a conversation me and Adam have had with people, especially with Michael, asking for smaller fighters to watch. Eder Joffrey, even though there's not as much footage as there should be, he was a fantastic watch. So anyone who doesn't know him, give him a watch, look him up on YouTube, and I think you will fall in love with him. Yeah. Going on to number 4.
Sorry, just want to jump in there quickly. I'm glad you said him because I was just going to mention him because the wonderful boxing people we follow all over Twitter, and they all have mentioned him. So had he not been mentioned, I was going to mention him. So well done, Luke, there on that. Keep going.
Number 4 is the Brown Bomber. Actually, before I move away from Eder Joffrey, he has my favorite nickname of the lot as well here, which it translates to Little Golden Rooster. So he was like a fighting cock, basically. That was his style. So Brazil's best ever fighter.
The boxer as well, isn't it? Brendan
Irvine.
That's it, Brendan Irvine, yeah.
So number 4 on my list is the Brown Bomber Joe Louis. In my opinion, he is no less than number 2 of the best heavyweights of all time. You hear people, you talk about heavyweights, it's always Ali, it's Tyson, it's George Foreman. You never really hear Joe Louis be mentioned. And I think Joe Louis stylistically had one of the easiest on the eye styles in heavyweight boxing. He didn't box, he glided through the ring. Everything was poetry in motion. He had a perfect jab, probably the greatest puncher in the heavyweight division as well. Like he was kind of like a Wilder, where if he hits you, it's lights out. And there was a great quote from Max Baer, who he fought. And Max Baer said, "If you want to know fear, be stood across the ring from Joe Louis when you know he wants an early night." And I think that sums it up perfectly. And Max Baer was a big, imposing heavyweight as well. You know, he was a feared man. And it goes to show that, you know, if Joe Louis can strike fear into you, and that's nothing to be trifled with, you know. I think you could put him in any era. I think he'd come out on top mostly. I think he'd beat any heavyweight that's around today, to be honest. He's a fantastic technician, silky smooth with everything he did. He had a great defense. He had a great chin also. And he proved that when he fought Rocky Marciano when he was, as they say in Coming to America, 137 years old. He had a great chin. You know, Marciano really had to work for the fight that night, even as old as Louis was. The reason Louis came back was very sad. He was treated very poorly, especially with the World War II situation that was going on. You know, if you look into that, he had, you know, racism basically, and he fought. Notable fights I'll give for that would be Primo Carnera, who was the giant of the time. You know, he was 6'6", nearly 20 stone, and Joe Louis knocked him out. You know, Max Baer again, as I mentioned earlier. Max Schmeling then was the World War II, you know, America versus Germany fight, which he did lose in the Yankee Stadium, but it was a fantastic fight. He then went on to rematch Schmeling and knocked him out in a round. You know, he came back and showed how good he was. And also another good fight of his, which went the distance, was with Jersey Joe Walcott. That was a very good 15-round fight. If you can find footage of that, you know, Jersey Joe was an all-time great himself, and that was two all-time greats going at it. So they're fights I'd recommend to look at for Joe Louis. But watch his whole career if you can, because he was fantastic. Number 3 is, I'm trying to go through the original weight classes, by the way. So I've had bantamweight, we have heavyweight there. Now we're going into welterweight. And it's Wilfred Benitez. I feel like he is.
Just before you continue on Wilfred Benitez, Marty was sending me his list, and Wilfred Benitez is on his, and he put in brackets, Luke can call that one. So you immediately you were going to say it.
Yeah, Wilfred Benitez, otherwise known as El Radar, for his seemingly instinctual ability to get out of the way of shots. One of the finest defensive fighters ever. He had it down to a fine art. And one thing that's amazing about Benitez is he's the youngest heavyweight champion, the youngest world champion, of all time, which is 17 years old. And that, I don't think that'll ever be beaten. It's not been beaten since, and I don't think it's going to be beaten. It's been nearly 50 years. So it's a hell of a feat, you know, 17 years of age. Now, with Benitez, his problem was he didn't peak too early, but he lost interest too early. So he was a champion at 17. By the time he got to age 20, he got fed up with people telling him what to do. He was living the high life, women, cars, money, nights out, everything. So by the time he was getting into his physical prime, he'd actually mentally given up. You know, and he took losses that he necessarily might not have taken. Like, I believe at his best he would have beaten Sugar Ray Leonard. I think there should be the Fabulous 5, you know, instead of the Fabulous 4, and he should be part of it. And that's why I feel like he is underappreciated, because you mention Ray Leonard, you mention Hearns, you mention Hagler, Duran. No one mentions Benitez amongst them, I find. And I know Sugar Ray Leonard had that flashy style with the hands, but for me personally, Benitez had the most easy style on the eye. When he landed a power shot, it was clean. When he dodged a punch, he didn't make it miss by much, but you could tell he'd made it miss, and it just glided over him like it was nothing. It's like he was fighting on fast forward and they were in slow motion. You know, he made it look so easy. Now, fights I'm going to recommend for him would be Antonio Cervantes, who he won the world title against at 17. And Antonio Cervantes was like 62-2 as well. He had an amazing record and was the lineal champion at the time. So it was no mean feat beating him at 17. And then we've got the three others who I mentioned, Sugar Ray Leonard, Tommy Hearns and Roberto Duran. Now, Benitez did roll back the years against Duran. I think he was only 23 when he fought Duran, when I say rolling back the years. But I mean, because of how long his career had been, he had a really good virtuoso performance and just didn't let Duran in and box the head off him. He had a great performance against Sugar Ray Leonard also. You know, that was nip and tuck. And then against Tommy Hearns, he just wasn't at the races that night mentally and lost. But yeah, an amazing fighter and someone who I think should be talked about much more.
Luke, in terms of the Puerto Rico's best fighters, where would you put Benitez? Would you put Benitez up there with the Yacotos and Trinidad? You put number one, do you?
Number one.
Wow. Okay.
I think he is a much better fighter than Miguel Carter or Felix Trinidad.
Well, okay.
Yeah, I think Trinidad is well above Cotto anyways. But yeah, I have Benitez as number one for me in Puerto Rico. Now his record was a fantastic one. He went all the way up to middleweight. You know, he boxed at welterweight, light middle, and middle. Light middle was a very new division when he was boxing in it. But yeah, he had 62 fights, won 53, 31 of them by KO, and had 8 losses. So, you know, when you think of who he fought, you know, 8 losses ain't bad. Then number 2, now number 1 and 2, I was really, really arguing with myself over, but number 2 is Henry Armstrong. And his nickname was Homicide Hank. And it was very apt because when he boxed, he was looking for a homicide. He was coming in.
Next week we're having a special collection so Michael can keep his lights on throughout the show. Please send what you can.
I'm waiting for him to disappear out the door when a little girl opens it.
Yeah, it's the hike in electricity in Wales, I think.
Honestly, oh Jesus!
I'm so sorry. Let me just change this lamp.
I actually thought it was going to be the gas lamp that they brought down to the mines that you're going to turn on.
Looking, boys, it's going to be this now. Big improvement. Watch.
Then the canary in first.
There we are. I'm so sorry to disturb you guys. That's better.
You're all right. Just bring a torch next week, all right? No, so Henry Armstrong. Now, what's so special about him? Back when there was only 8 divisions, he held 3 of those divisions' titles at once. He started off at featherweight, and he went all the way up to middleweight, believe it or not. But he held the featherweight, the lightweight, and the welterweight titles all at once. He had 19 defenses of that welterweight title. Now, he only had a very short career as well. His career was only 8 years. It went from 1937 to 1945. And in those 8 years, he had 180 fights, won 149 of them, with 99 by KO, and only lost 21 fights out of those. It's a statistic that you probably never see again in boxing. And all within 8 years. You know, most people, how many fights do people have in 8 years now?
Yeah, that's
right, Stephen. Yeah, he's the only one. Now his style, and this is the reason he's number 2 for me, because the number 1 person has a style that I prefer. He was the definition of a pressure fighter. He basically invented pressure fighting. He invented the inside game, where to put your head, where to position your arms, where to position your shoulders, how to leverage someone. He was only 5'5", and he went all the way up to middleweight. And he was able to mix it with these big middleweight fighters at 5'5". And he was able to position himself, use leverage, move them around the ring. He had great footwork. Cutting off the ring was not a problem. And he'd land big shots to the head and body, which is why he had 99 KOs. And fantastic fighter. There's a few notable fights that I'd like to mention. He fought a fella called Barney Ross, and that was an unbelievable fight. That was toe-to-toe action. And then there's another fight versus Lou Ambers. Now, they fought twice. And their first fight was Fight of the Year in 1937. Incredible fight. And then, yeah, just look him up on YouTube. There's clips as well. There's highlights. But he's just an amazing technician. And what I think about these fighters from back in the day, like the 50s, 40s, 30s, people think it wasn't as technical of a game as it is now, but it was more technical. They fought more often. They had to know how to look after themselves better. They had to know how to not get cut.
Boxing was far more popular. So you had a bigger depth pool of boxers.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The talent pool was so deep. And,
And
they were fighting every...
So it was more concentrated.
Yeah, they were fighting every few weeks. And to not get cut, like you see the Olympics, people can get cut in the first fight. You know, it's very easy to get cut in 30 seconds. So they had to know how to look after themselves. He was mixing it up, fighting on the inside while keeping his nose clean. And that's an incredible feat. The only fighter you'd nearly put near him for inside fighting is Roberto Duran. And he learned a lot from the likes of Henry Armstrong, you know. Now, what a fight that would have been as well if we could get the time machine again. But yeah, number one of my all-time favorite fighters is Archie Moore, the Mongoose, and then later known as the Old Mongoose because he carried on boxing into his late 40s, which was unheard of back then in the early 40s and 50s. So he had 220 fights. He won 186 of those, and 132 of them were by KO, which is just...
It's the KOs
ridiculous.
over 100 is nuts.
Yeah, 132 knockouts, like. And in 220 fights, he only lost 23 of those. And a lot of them were early on, and then late on when he was in his mid-40s. So branching into light heavyweight now. So he was light heavyweight champion, and the longest ever reigning light heavyweight champ. He reigned for over 10 years. Now, during that spell, he went up and down from heavyweight to light heavyweight and mixed it up with the heavyweights as well. And fought some absolute greats. He should, well, I say should, he had a controversial fight with Rocky Marciano. It's not too well known what the controversy was. Basically, he put Rocky Marciano down. And back then, in title fights, there was no standing 8 count. But the ref gave him one. So Marciano got up at 2, really wobbly, really dazed. And the referee left until 8 seconds before Archie Moore could get back in on him. And he'd lost the chance then. Marciano had recovered. Whereas if the ref had left it and got up at 2, all right, fight on, we could have had a totally different history book with Marciano not being undefeated and Archie Moore knocking him out. You know, which is incredible to think of, considering Archie Moore was a natural light heavyweight. And he had the style I love. He can make you miss. He would counter instantly. He had amazing footwork. He'd circle you. He'd move you around. He could close off the distance so well. He cut you off if you wanted to be aggressive while making you miss. He had that shoulder roll / cross arm guard, which was made more famous by old George Foreman. And it's something that Archie Moore implemented during his older years when his reflexes weren't as good. You know, if shots came, he could just cover up here, move, and block the shots coming to the head while being able to counter. Incredible fighter. Now, a couple of fights I mentioned. He fought a fellow called Jimmy Bivens, and he absolutely obliterated him. But it was a really good fight starting off. And then another one versus a fella, hope I'm pronouncing it right, Ivan Durrell. They had an absolute barnstormer. He actually put Moore down a couple of times, and Moore rallied back to win that fight by KO. And it was one of the fights of the year that year. Definitely recommend watching that one because you're looking at absolute greatness and heart, because he never really had to show up before. But again, these old fighters are fighting every week. To get 220 fights in, you're going to have to be fighting more than 2-3 times a year, like the champions of today. So that's my top 5. Archie Moore number 1. I mean, I wouldn't argue with anyone to put Armstrong above him, but just stylistically, Archie Moore is one of my favourites, and I've studied him a lot over the years and tried to implement a few things of his into my own style. Now, if you could mix those 5 fighters up, I think you'd have the greatest human being that ever lived. But it's impossible to do that. And just my honourable mentions now. I'm going to give Rocky Marciano as 1. Now, I know you might think that's a strange one, but the reason I say it is because people think he was just a slugger, and he wasn't. He was a lot. If he was just a slugger, there's no way he would have got to 49-0. He was very clever with his positioning. People say, you know, the heavyweights, the big heavyweights use their size to their advantage. The small ones can do that too. And he was able to use his height. He leaned back. He fought behind his right hand down here. His left hand low. And he was pawing out all the time, inching forward. And he had an incredible chin, an incredible engine, and he had incredible heart. Now, the stories that are told of him in his training camps say that he trained like nobody else, that he was one of the fittest men on the planet, basically, at the time. And he showed that with being able to carry his power and his chin through 15 rounds, no problem. Never got tired, never wore out. Now, we think of the modern day boxers like Joe Joyce, who has that same kind of style. He'll come forward, take a shot if he has to land his own. But the difference between Marciano and Joyce is Marciano was more explosive. The Susie Q, as it's known, he would take your head off with it. And he could take a punch too and recover very quickly, as he's shown versus Archie Moore. And I think people shouldn't look at him so much of a slugger. If they actually watched him, they'd realise he was using his brain. He was actually a bit of a technician. And he was able to position fighters, use his head, and use his feet. He had good feet for someone who had flat feet. He edged forward all the time. He never gave anyone a bit of breathing space. And I think that's why, to me, he's a bit underrated, because people do look at him as just a slugger.
Okay.
My second one is Mike Mccallum, body snatcher, the original body snatcher, not Dylan White. And, he was a fantastic fighter, known for his losses more than his wins. I think that's fair enough to say.
Yeah.
But he fought a bit too long. Like most great fighters did, like nearly all the lads I've mentioned there. But yeah, he was obviously incredible body puncher. Really good defense, really good footwork. Could have a fight when he wanted to, could box when he wanted to. And I'm not going to name unmentionable fights because there's so many. Like, he's been in a lot of great fights. And he was in that golden era of the middleweights as well, and even, fought the likes of Roy Jones and gave Roy Jones a decent fight for a 41-year-old, I don't think there's many 41-year-olds who could have mixed it with Jones ever, so that shows you the class of man he was. And my last one is Donald Curry, another fighter known for his losses more than his wins, but especially Lloyd Honeyghan for the British people watching this. But yeah, Donald Curry, what a fighter. He went from welterweight up to middleweight, and light middleweight he fought at as well. Some amazing fights there. If you watch him, he was, again, just a beautiful boxer, great jab, really good footwork, fantastic defense, and he could punch as well. Like, when Lloyd Honeyghan went over to fight him for the lineal welterweight title, he was beating everybody, knocking everyone out. No one wanted to fight him. Lloyd Honeyghan, I think he was ranked like number 7. I don't think he was even in the top 5, but he went over to fight him anyways, and got the amazing upset victory. But yeah, Donald Curry as well. Look him up, guys. If you don't know about him, get to know, because he was an amazing fighter as well. And that's my lot.
Cheers, Luke.
Awesome. That was excellent.
Yeah.
Take some beating now.
Speaking of taking a beating, let's go to Wales. Hello, Michael. Let's have yours.
Right, so basically, if you put my 5 guys in a room with Luke's 5 guys, I've got no doubt that Luke's 5 guys would come out on top. Not a doubt.
That's shocking.
But what I will say is my list is kind of different to Luke's. So Luke's list is a phenomenal list of really great fighters who really did not get their dues, despite how great they were. My guys some of them I think it's fair to say overachieved. They have kind of great Cinderella kind of background stories that aren't spoken about enough. So I'm going to start off. We're going to go down to South Wales, in the homeland of Cardiff, in God's country. Okay, a fighter called Steve Robinson. Okay, he started his career off a few dodgy losses on the road.
Yeah,
but he had 9 losses before he was given his opportunity to fight for the vacant world title against John Davidson, I believe. Now, he was an underdog for this fight. He went all the way to Newcastle, and he won on points. Some people could have said at the time might have been a one-off lucky win. But what happened afterwards, Steve Robinson actually defended his title 6 times, okay? Beating top fighters like Duke McKenzie, who was a freeweight world champion, who also doesn't get the credit he deserves, who I'm going to mention a little bit later on, but not in my list, okay? But he was a top fighter. He beat Duke McKenzie. He also beat Colin McMillan, who was also a top featherweight at the time, who he also was expected to beat, and he got the win. And he fought a few other defenses who I'm not too knowledgeable on, but ultimately, Steve Robinson, this was a massive opportunity that he couldn't decline. He was actually working at Debenhams at the time, and he was given 48 hours notice to fight for the world title and ended up winning it. So it was a great story how he went on to defend the belt 6 times and then eventually losing it to Nazim Hamed, who we all know went on to have a great career, arguably Britain's greatest featherweight boxer. And in Steve Robinson's defense as well, there have been stories that Steve Robinson was only given about a month's notice to actually fight Nazim Hamed and was almost forced into making that defense. And Nazim Hamed was already training. I think he had a good 10-week training camp or whatever they needed back then. So I think he was done dirty a little bit. Not saying he would have beaten Nazim, because obviously Nazim's an all-time great, but he definitely would have had a better chance if he had more preparation. I agree with him on that one. So we're going to move on now, more up north, to Adam's part of the world. A fighter called Scott Harrison, who I believe could have gone on to have a very strong career. In terms of the profile of a boxer, in terms of toughness, being entertaining, being involved in great fights, I think Scott Harrison could have really been an all-time great for Scotland. Fortunately, had a bad addiction. He had his problems with alcohol. He got problems with the law. I think he was involved in some sort of burglary. But he was a solid world champion at the time, and I think he could have achieved a lot more in his career. He fought Wayne McCullough, which was a great win for him at the time. He also, funny enough, beat Steve Robinson, although Steve Robinson was on the slide and he wasn't a world champion around that time. I think he just lost his European belt. And he'd also beaten Manuel Medina. So Manuel Medina was a solid Mexican back in the early 2000s. I think Medina beat him in the first fight, but then in the rematch, Harrison regained his title and beat Medina. But unfortunately,
he's still looking to fight now, I think, Harrison.
Yeah, I think he got some license. Yeah, so the British Board of Control refused to grant him a license, but he got some license from some other dodgy governing body. But I think that was a few years ago that this happened, but I'm not sure whether he was successful. He's been involved in white collar fights. I don't know what he's kind of done since, but he did make a comeback later on in his career, and I believe he fought Liam Walsh, but he lost on points in that fight. So he never really. I know he went to prison for a few years, and he did. And I think that's correct, Adam, wasn't it? I think he went to prison for a few years. Yeah, that's it.
Well, it was in Spain.
That's it. He got involved with loads of shit outside of boxing, and that kind of fucked up his career ultimately. But I think he could have had a really good career if he. But however, I do think he is a forgotten, very good world champion who could have gone on to have a much better career than he did. So now we're going to move back down the country.
As well.
Yeah, I love Steve Robinson. He's a good mate of mine as well, Steve Robinson. He's actually been in my corner for a couple of my fights. So, really good man.
Nice.
We're going to move now back down south to London in Hackney. A guy called the Hackney Rock, Dennis Andrews. Okay. So Dennis Andrews was kind of a similar story to Steve Robinson. Okay. He was kind of that boxer. I hope Steve doesn't mind me saying this, but kind of a boxer that wasn't really meant to go on to do much. He was involved at a time where boxing was really at a crooked time, when you were fighting in 15 rounders in private venues, full of cigars, smoking, horrible venues. The mafia heavily involved in the sport. But with Dennis Andrews, he was fighting British title. He was fighting solid British title fights, European title fights, and eventually he got his opportunity to fight in the States, where he won the world title. I can't remember, if I just look at Box Rec a sec, very quickly, who he won his first world title against. Let me double check. JB Williamson, okay? So he won the WBC World Light Heavyweight title. And then in a couple of defenses after that, he was actually against Tommy Hearns. Now, this was a mean Tommy Hearns at light heavyweight, really sharp, really powerful, and he was completely overmatched in that fight, Andrews, okay? But what Andrews did, he actually left the UK and he went to join Emmanuel Stewart, Tommy Hearns' gym, to join the Kronk gym. And he rebuilt his career. And when Tommy Hearns actually, I think he might have moved down or up. I can't remember if he moved down or up, but he definitely vacated that WBC light heavyweight belt. And Andrews ended up regaining the light heavyweight title. I think he beat Jeff Harden in his first fight. Was it? I think Jeff Harden. I'm pretty sure it was. Let me double check.
Even there, Andrews versus Harding just flames. So obviously, that was a phenomenal fight.
But I know he had. Yeah, so he regained his against Tony Willis in a vacant light heavyweight fight, and then he defended it. In his first defense, it was against Jeff Harden. And then in the rematch, he fought Jeff Harden again and actually got the title back and ended up retiring as a 3-time light heavyweight champion. So, yeah, a very long career for Dennis Andrews. And he wasn't the most easiest on the eye, but he definitely overachieved from where he came from. And a funny story, actually, I read earlier was around the same time Dennis Andrews defended the belt, he actually crossed paths with Frank Bruno, who I think might have just lost to Mike Tyson at the time, all bashed up. And he saw Bruno was getting all the press and everything, even though he had lost. Whereas Dennis Andrews, straight back on the tube, sitting down on his lap with the WBC belt, no one caring, but everyone was all, obviously the big story was Frank Bruno getting bashed up by Tyson. So yeah, quite an interesting one back then. Very underrated fighter. So then that takes me now to number 2. It's Paul the Punisher Williams, okay? So back in the 2000s, this was a bloke that no one wanted to fight. He was a 3-time world champion, world champion. So started from welterweight, then up to light middleweight, and then up to middleweight, okay? And he if you look at his record, it's kind of a who's who on his record, the amount of people he fought. And at the time, your Mayweathers and I'm pretty sure at one point him and Mayweather were both a welterweight, and no one wanted a piece of Paul Williams at the time. If I just want to read out some of the names he's fought, and bear in mind, he's only lost twice, Williams, okay? So if I go down to the bottom, the notable names, I've got Shamba Mitchell, who was a decent fighter, Antonio Margarito, which was an absolute war. He fought Carlos Quintana twice, and back then Quintana was a good fighter. He fought Sergio Martinez twice, Kermit Cintron, and Erislan Di Lara. So he's fought some who's really in the 3 weight classes that he's fought, and only coming up short twice. I think, unfortunately for Williams, his most memorable moment was probably getting sparked up by Martinez in about 2 rounds, which is one of the best knockouts, if probably the best knockout I've ever seen, if I'm being honest with you. It was absolutely
scary.
Terrific. But if you watch the first fight, actually Williams wins the first one, and that was an absolute barnstorm. Really close fight.
Michael.
Say that again, sorry.
Williams, where's he from?
Sorry, yeah. So we actually turn our attentions now to the States, okay? Yeah, that side of the world, across the Atlantic. That's where my next 2 fighters are going to be. Okay, so Paul Williams was a tremendous fighter, standing about 6'2", and he had the frame to carry from welterweight all the way up to middleweight, and involved some unbelievable fights. If I had to recommend two of his wins to go and watch, it would probably be the Sergio Martinez first fight and the Carlos Quintana rematch. Both absolute barnstormers. Well, actually, the Quintana one actually knocks him out earlier, but that first fight he lost to Quintana was a bit of a war. So. And Margarito as well, actually. Margarito was a very...
I won't say, is Margarito ever not in a war? All I remember Margarito was absolute, wars every time.
Very sad. What did happen to Williams as well? His career was cut short. We don't know how, we don't know if he could carried on.
I think Williams was scheduled to fight Canelo, wasn't he, at that time when the accident happened, if I remember correctly. So
we don't know. He could have gone on to beat whoever. Yeah, it's very sad to see such a great fighter's career cut short by then.
It was 100%. And now I'm going to take it to the top of my list. Okay, this is a fighter that actually Luke touched on, which was an honorable mention, and I'm going to mention Mike Mccallum. For me, Mike Mccallum was a complete fighter. He was absolutely unreal. There wasn't anything in his game that he didn't do well, in my opinion, and. Again, like Luke touched on, his record is just full of who's, and the wins that he's had. He was at one point in the era of Sugar Ray Leonard, Duran, Hagler, Hearns. No one wanted to touch Mccallum. Absolutely nobody did. And Mccallum is one of those kind of high risk, low rewards. But what a fighter he was. He also has some honourable mentions. Michael Watson went over there to challenge him. Harold Graham went over there to challenge him. Came up short. I think he would have done the same to Eubank, Ben. I think he would have beaten them all, in my opinion. Yeah. And then like you said, Luke, at 40 years old, he's fighting Roy Jones. He fought Tony 3 times, drew the first fight with Tony, losing on points every time. He beat Julian Jackson. This is a prime. Julian Jackson is most dangerous as well. Probably arguably the biggest punch in middleweight there's ever been. Yeah. He stopped him. He beat Donald Curry. No one wanted to touch Donald Curry. The big names anyway. Just ridiculous career. I think someone that, we like to mention kind of the golden 80s era, but there's so many fighters kind of outside that big 4 that don't get a look in, kind of like Wilfred Benitez's, Mike Mccallum's, and I definitely put Mccallum up there for sure.
His day, Mccallum could have beat anyone, 100%.
100%. And like I said, for me, he was just a complete fighter. Just did everything well. He was a top fighter, and I'm surprised really he's not a top trainer because he just did the basics perfectly. And honorable mention. So I did have a list of honorable mentions, but I'm only going to go for a couple. So
Go
I'm
on.
going to go with Julian Jackson. Okay, I
Yeah.
think Julian Jackson was a great. He was a phenomenal puncher, one of the most ferocious boxers of that kind of late 80s, 90s era. But I think, unfortunately, kind of like Luke touched on earlier, I think he's probably more remembered for his losses, probably rather than his wins, I would say. There's not. I think what Julian Jackson lacked is probably that big marquee win in his career. Because I think
Harold Graham, that was
a big win.
His lights off that day.
Yeah, I think the thing with Graham is Graham was a great fighter, but because he'd never won the world title, I think that's kind of, for me, that doesn't really count as that marquee stand-up name. Another one I would like to touch on, I think some of you guys might scratch your head at this, but I think Steve Cunningham was another fighter that really kind of overachieved in his career. He came to the sport really late. I believe he was a Marine, part of the Nazim Richardson Philadelphia kind of gym. And he's gone on to beat some very good names at the cruiserweight division. There was that Cuban, I forgot his name now, but he was
Cruz?
Cuban southpaw. Which one, sorry?
Was it Cruz or Salido? Salido was the heavyweight.
I'll have to double check on that
Perez.
one. But there was
Mike Perez.
Mike Perez. I don't think it was Perez. He beat
the honourable Irishman, the Irish Cuban.
Yeah. But Cunningham was involved. Cunningham was involved in some great fights at cruiserweight, and I think he's a two-time IBF cruiserweight champion as well. And I think from where he came from, just from being a really fit guy, I think that's how he kind of tough guy. Yeah, exactly. Chin Fury. Fury's actually gone on record to say that Cunningham was probably his hardest fight because of the movement and the resilience he's shown. He really put a lot of pressure.
Pablo Hernandez.
That's the one, Pablo Hernandez, who at the time was number one in the division. Not that time, but he did go on to become it at one point. So yeah, he was a very. I think Cunningham was a very underrated fighter as well. Cool. And there was someone else. I'm gonna give Adam the reins for that.
I think we've had loads now, Michael. That was brilliant.
Luke was going to ask me a question.
Quick question: Enzo versus Cunningham. How do you reckon?
Right, I think Enzo was definitely the bigger puncher out of the two, but I think if you look at I think Steve Cunningham definitely has the better wins, the better resume. I think if you look at Enzo's record, there's not really that big marquee win for Enzo, despite being a really good fighter in his prime. It's a tough one. I don't think Enzo had the best chin, but I give Enzo the power edge, whereas I think Cunningham probably would have got to him late and probably outworked him.
Do you reckon?
If I'm being honest, yeah.
If you weren't Welsh, would you have said Cunningham easier?
Say that again, sorry.
If you weren't Welsh, would you have said Cunningham easier?
Possibly, because I do like Enzo. He's a nice guy as well.
Yeah. Anyway, right, now we're coming on to the Scotsman in the room, which is the wonderful Adam.
Brilliant. So I'm going to very quickly pick up on the point the boys have made a couple of times, which is they are best known for their loss. And I think what holds a lot of these fighters back is what we expected or what they could have been. And I'm going to touch on, in my honor, I'm going to do honorable mentions first and work up. Mike Mccallum. So I had a massive list, just like Luke, and it was basically just a lot of 90s middleweights was a good portion of this. And it's because if you watch Mike Mccallum when he was coming through, Mike Mccallum was, like you said, as Michael said, perfect. And he doesn't get his due for what he did achieve because we all sit there and go, it could have been more. And that's a theme coming through this. I've got Tony down here. I think Tony is one of the best fighters you'll ever see. And he's hardly underappreciated, but I think because he didn't get the wins, because he didn't have the dedication. Just from, I'd say, Luke's standpoint of how good you judge a fighter, well, I think he was that good, so that's how we judge him rather than what he achieved. James Toney is one of the best I've ever seen. Bernard Hopkins. So if we talk about Wilfred Benitez, one of the most impressive things in boxing is that win at 17. To win a world title at 17 years old is mental. Bernard Hopkins unified the light heavyweight title at 49 years old. That is absolutely insane. And there's another record we will never see beaten again. It's utterly incredible. Now I'm going to throw one out there that I think is going to get a few looks because I think a lot of people think this individual is overrated. And I think it's Miguel Carter. Okay? Now, Carter himself, I don't think he's better than Benitez, and I don't think he's better than Trinidad. I think he got a lot of hype at the time, and he was very well sold. But he's actually underappreciated in terms of the fighter he was. He beat Judah, he beat Mosley, and he beat Margarito. Those are 3 really, really good wins. He wasn't the second coming of Trinidad. He wasn't as good as there, but he's underappreciated for who he was, which was a brilliant fighter. And he's my personal favorite
I agree.
Puerto Rican fighter. I think that's how a lot of this is framed, that it's not necessarily fighters who don't get their due because it's what they could have been. People judge them on that and think they underachieved, whereas if you actually sit and look at what they did achieve, that's what it is. So those are my...
Even jumped in there with, Carter's a great shout, so he's got your back as well.
And my
Cotto had some
Cotto
great wins. Cotto had some great wins, didn't he?
To have Cotto's back as well, I think he gave Mayweather his hardest fight.
Yeah.
Above
fight.
Yeah, like great boxing match. Like that's a clinic in session. That is.
To add to that, Luke,
I think, really, really good fighter.
And I think with Cotto as well, against Mayweather, he actually boxed his way in to land punches, whereas Maidana kind of just threw himself at Mayweather, didn't he? But Cotto worked behind the jab and actually landed good punches, working his way in to get any success in that.
I gave him 4 rounds against Floyd. that's not often heard of.
Yeah, I don't know about
again, he was one of these fighters that you did watch him, back then. I mean, definitely Miguel Carter. He was.
We were robbed of an amazing light welterweight matchup with Ricky Hatton and Miguel Carter.
That should have happened. Hatton and Carter should have fought.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's go back to Adam.
The final honourable mention is Jorge Linares, for exactly the same reasons. One of those fighters who we thought was the second coming of Ray Leonard, and he didn't have a chin, but he was a 3-weight world champion. He was the lightweight world champion for a while. And is the most beautiful fighter I've ever seen. I've never seen somebody throw a punch, and it's honestly, that's one of those things where you'll see in this list. He's so pretty, like the way through those punches are gorgeous, and that's one of the things I love. So a lot of time for Linares. On to my actual fighters. So number 5, and this was the guy I took out for the Brazilian gentleman that Luke mentioned earlier, Jorge, principally because I couldn't say his name. It is Daniel Zaragoza. Okay, he is a bantamweight from the 80s, or bantamweight and a super bantamweight. And he is another fighter who, because he was the smaller weights back in the day, you just don't hear about him much. His record was 55 wins, 8 defeats, and 3 draws. 2-weight world champion. He was a super bantamweight champion for 9 years. Okay, and he was bloody brilliant to watch. He won, or was super bantamweight champion at 39 years old in the 90s. That is absolutely insane. And it took Eric Morales to retire him. He is one of the best bantamweights ever. He's not quite as good as the Brazilian, but the fight I want you to watch, because I've got a load of lists here. He beat Wayne McCullough. He beat Sanchez. It's Zarata. Okay? So he fights a fighter called Zarata for the WBC Bantamweight Championship. For context, Zarata comes into that fight 59-2 with 57 knockouts. And that's who he beats for the title. He's a phenomenal fighter. So
ridiculous.
Really, yeah, it's absolutely insane when you think about it. One of the best punches ever. And he really doesn't get the kind of the limelight he deserves for what he does, for what he is. And I love Mexican fighters. He's one of my little favorites. So I really enjoy watching him. So that's the fight, as Zaragoza versus Zarata. Number 4 is Miguel Kessler.
Okay.
He is one of the really solid super middleweights. Okay, he's a 4-time champion with a record of 46-3. Okay, he wasn't Ward. This is what holds Kessler back, is he was never that guy. He wasn't Calzaghe, and he wasn't Ward, but he was probably the best of the rest. Now, I was at the second Kessler-Froch fight, and it was brilliant. But in my opinion, the very peak Miguel Kessler, the one that fought Joe Calzaghe, is better than the best Froch.
Yeah,
because he's not that. Because he doesn't get the same marketing. He just doesn't get the appreciation there. But he is a 4-time world champion at super middleweight. Has multiple title defenses across multiple reigns. He's a really underappreciated fighter, and I think we'll get into the Hall of Fame soon.
Okay.
So that's a really interesting one. So Miguel Kessler, the fight to watch is the first Froch fight. Like that's
Amazing fight.
It was brilliant, and it's the one to watch. Also, the Miguel Kessler fight against Joe Calzaghe is the one that convinces me how great Joe actually is. It's not the Hopkins win, it's not the Roy Jones win, it's the Kessler win.
Joe's best win by far is his Kessler.
That's Joe's best win. So number
For me,
3.
Lacey.
Not even
No,
Lacey.
I think Kessler would have absolutely starched Lacey, I reckon.
No,
but
for Joe, because Joe was against all
that was
odds.
just coming out. Lacey was just
that
coming
was,
out. But
the difference is the general consensus versus what actually is often very different.
Yeah.
And Kessler is a much better overall fighter than Jeff Lacey. Jeff
Kessler
Lacey
was
had
the
that
best
American
fighter in the
hype train
division.
behind him.
But Jeff Lacey.
Kessler was the best when Calzaghe beat him. Kessler was
Like
the best in the division.
one thing that shocked me and did disappoint me about Kessler in that rematch with Froch was he struggled to get past Froch's jab.
Yeah.
I don't know what was wrong that night, but
He's
yeah,
old.
he
That was the thing.
what was he, 38?
Yeah, I think he was about 38, but the key is he hadn't been training in the way that Froch had been training. Froch had been fighting at the elite level, and Kessler had been out the ring, and this was Kessler just trying to get back in.
Yeah.
So that was that. Number 3, and our friend Adam's Boxing Show on Twitter.
Also,
yes, go.
sorry to cut you off, Adam. Shout out to Froch for one of my favorite ring entrances ever at that rematch.
Yes.
With the Welcome to the Jungle.
Yeah, that was
My
a great
God,
one.
I'm so jealous that you were there for that. Like that is
brilliant. Oh,
class.
phenomenal. That was one of the best ones. And the Boucher fight as well, but different one. So
Anyway, back on track.
Mark Too Sharp Johnson is a flyweight and superfly from the early to mid 90s, and he went all the way into the early 2000s. One of those fighters again. One, he was poorly managed. Unfortunately, during the research for this, I discovered he had some less than savory incidences with drugs and hitting women, so I was a bit disappointed in that. Retired with a record of 44-5 with 28 knockouts, but he never got that win. Okay, it wasn't like Lopez. He never got that win. Watch him, just watch him, guys. He is Roy Jones shrunk down. He is brilliant. And if you're looking at small fighters to watch, Michael, Mark Too Sharp Johnson. Watch him win the world title. Watch him fight guys like Montiel, Juarez, Sor Vaporin. Johnson is honestly one of the best fighters you'll ever see. He just didn't translate it into major wins. Plenty of title defenses. We didn't translate it into major wins. And that
The Montiel fight is definitely a good one.
There you go. You've got Stephen's seal of approval on that, Adam.
Excellent. I'm doing well so far. Right. Number 2. And I've got to be honest, I would imagine you all had money on this particular gentleman making it into my list, which is the man from just up the road, Ricky Burns.
Hey!
Yeah. So, Ricky Burns, 44-8-1, 16 knockouts, 3-weight world champion. Much like Duke McKenzie, a 3-weight world champion, there are not many from those in the UK, right? Mm-hmm. Ricky was brilliant. He was never the poster boy. You know, he kind of came through around Hatton time. Even in Scotland, when he came through, he lost to Johansson and he lost to Arthur. And that was even more impressive, that Ricky was able to come back from losing for the British title twice. The third fight I ever watched live was Ricky Burns challenging Rocky Martinez for the world title. He is down in the first round.
Nice.
With one of the first punches. And he gets up and he schools him. He didn't have the power, but Ricky was tough as nails, never stopped. He was in with some incredible fighters. He did get some very dubious decisions his way as well. But the fights I will recommend, Rocky Martinez when he wins the world title for the first time. Kevin Mitchell in his career best performance for the lightweight world title. DeRocco when he wins the world title in the third weight class, when it looks like he's about 2 trimesters in. Very strange watching him at 140 pounds. But the one
shit that guy minds. Yeah, I thought they were. Not away from Burns, but
no,
he wasn't the strongest champion ever, was he? To beat that,
he was not. No, he was not. But to watch him win three world champions, incredible. The fight I want you to watch is Jose Gonzalez, because for 6 rounds, Jose Gonzalez beats the brakes off Ricky Burns. He looks at Ray Leonard incarnate. In the 7th round, Ricky sticks it on him, and the guy says, "Enough's enough." And that epitomized Ricky. He didn't have all the physical gifts. He was brilliant at the basics. He was tough as nails. And he worked this guy out, and he wanted it more. And that's why he achieved the things he did. We talk about guys in the UK that achieved far less, way more often. Okay? He won and defended multiple titles in multiple weight classes. He should be up there in the discussion for Britain's great fighters. Okay? Finally, my number one
Quick question, Adam.
Go for it.
Sorry. I know you're rating him as underrated or like underappreciated, but do you think kind of like Crawler, he overachieved?
100%. I think even more so than Crawler. I think he got every last ounce out of his abilities.
He had, yeah.
And I think when you look at Ricky, you don't see like a Ray Leonard, even a Mccallum. Like, you don't look at him and you go, wow. It's, really solid chin, throws a beautiful
He grinded you down.
He did, yeah. He didn't starch you either. He would grind you down. And I think that's what holds Ricky back is like, unless you're somebody like me, you don't put Ricky's fights back on the telly. I've watched the Martinez win at least 10 times. It's one of those nights.
I've watched the Crawford fight a few times.
The Crawford one. But that was
when you think. Sorry, I was just going to say, when you think Mike Mccallum, though, is a freeweight world champion, this is top draw, elite fighter. And Ricky Burns, who's also a freeweight world champion. No disrespect to Ricky Burns, you don't put him in the same level as Mike Mccallum, do you? Like,
am I right in saying he worked in Sports Direct while he was a world champion?
Yeah, Sports Direct when he first won the title. Yeah, but he's got a load of good wins. But he's not Mike Mccallum.
People who worked in, was it Debenhams? What was your man working in?
Steve Robinson's working as Debenhams.
And now we're
part time as well.
So my favorite story about Ricky Burns was he does his runs out in Coatbridge, which is I'm in West Glasgow and that's in East Glasgow, and it's not the nicest area in the world. And as he was out running, a group of the technical term in Scotland is Jakies, but we're going to call them hoodlums for the purposes of this, started chasing him. Rather than stopping fighting them, Ricky just simply outran them. He just kept running, and they tried, and they just could never catch him, and it kept happening, and they eventually gave up. And it was just Ricky is one of the fittest people you've ever seen in your life.
Great.
So
number one.
Number one. This fighter is very well appreciated, but in my opinion, he should be an all-time great. And he should be on the pantheon of the greatest ever Mexican fighters, the top 4. Okay, can you guess who he is?
Well, I'm thinking of my number one Mexican who just missed out on the top 5. Are you going to say Eric Morales?
I'm going to say Juan Manuel Marquez.
Oh yeah.
Oh yes.
So Marquez. I'm going to take you through the record. Marquez is 56, 7, and 1.
Stephen offered Lopez.
So Lopez is the one that's kind of normally up there. He's 56, 7, and 1 with 40 KOs. He is a 9-time 4-weight world champion. Okay. Juan Manuel Marquez beat Manny Pacquiao, and by God did he beat him when they finally gave it to him. In my opinion, Marquez won at least one of the other fights.
I agree. Okay?
So in my opinion, Marquez should be up on that. I think I gave Marquez, it was the 3rd one. I can't remember. It's the first I'm happy with the draw, and then they split the next 2, and obviously the 4th ended the way it does. He beat Juan Diaz when nobody wanted near Juan Diaz. He beat Marco Antonio Barrera. He beat Juan Joel Casamayor. He beat Michael Katsidis. These were brilliant fighters, and he did this up at the higher weight classes. Okay. Morales wanted no part of Marquez. The fight was there. He wanted no part of Marquez. The way he's done, like, obviously, again, Marquez is probably known for the fact that he lost to Mayweather. Okay, he had no business being in that fight, and Floyd is an awful style for him. He lost to Bradley again. It's another bad style. He is again one of the most beautiful punchers you will ever see. If you want to see how to technically throw punches and counterpunch, watch Juan Manuel Marquez. In my opinion, it goes Julio Cesar Chavez. It goes Salvador Sanchez. Then there is a battle between Lopez. You can talk about Canelo, but in my opinion, it should be Juan Manuel Marquez. Those are the greatest ever Mexican fighters, and I do not think he gets the appreciation for how bloody brilliant he was. Those are my picks, and I will die on this hill.
Very good. Well, please don't die this evening. Right. What I'm doing now
Can I just put in real quick, Enda? honorable mention to Salvador Sanchez, because it was him who missed off the number 5 spot.
Yeah.
In my list. I think he's the greatest Mexican fighter.
Okay. Right. What I'm going to do now is, with very little time left, but I'm just going to go Stevens first. So here's Ricardo Lopez, 55-0-1, only boxer I know of undefeated amateur and pro. Did everything exceptionally well, could box equally well at mid and close range.
Beautiful fighter as well. Another beautiful fighter.
Yeah.
Sorry there, boys. I had a bit of technical difficulties.
And Henry Armstrong, who
I've been there.
Luke, you said Henry, hadn't you? The only boxer to hold 3 weights at the same time when it was only 8. So again, now here's one that I would have nominated myself, and not just
sure.
Michael Spinks, one of the greatest light heavyweights, unfortunately only known by some as the guy KO'd by Tyson. Watch his light heavyweight reign. Again, this is always what happens when you have wonderful boxers in lesser divisions and they kind of move to heavyweight and they, you know, they're kind of a bit out of their depth there. But in light heavyweight in the 80s, nobody was as good as Michael Spinks, and it was an absolute pleasure to meet him. The next one we have is now I've actually heard of this chap, and I'm sure the boys have too. Virafal Seraphim, Thailand bantamweight champ from 1998 to 2006, making 14 defenses. He lost to Hezum
Apologies, lads. My internet went.
It's all right. Pay the bill next time. And
I know. I have to pay the man.
And then number 5 is finished with Yeah, what a beast. His fight with Tua is a must-watch, and he destroyed Chris Bird when he was unbeaten. Unfortunately, mental health troubled him. So, sorry to rush through them, Stephen, but that's Stephen's picks. And his honourable mentions, Mike Mccallum, Michael Carbale, Edwin Valero, and again, he said Demons got the better of him too. Now, Marty has gone with... and obviously they're not on screen, so I'm reading them out. It's Sam Langford, the most avoided fighter, small guy beating up big heavyweights, and the legends admitted they avoided him. Then we have Tim Witherspoon, who, you know, different people have different opinions on him. He said he got Don King disease. He proved in his comeback his best years were plagued. Then we've got Sumbu Callum Bay, after Leonard stole Hagler's title, that's Marty's words, not mine, and vacated, Callum Bay emerged as the ring's first lineal champion since, after taking Harold Graham's European title, was installed as top contender for the WBA belt, an impressive run of results up until the shock KO loss to none. Worth watching if you like skillful movement fighters. So that's Sumbu Callum Bay. There you go. Next one he said was Wilfred Benitez, and he did say in brackets, Luke can call that one, and Luke did. And finally, Antonio Esperanza stopped Barry McGuigan's conqueror Steve Cruz in a great fight. So Cruz Esperanza, and he defended his title 6 times. So that's
solid list.
That's a very solid list. And honourable mentions here. Domestically, and this is another one I would have mentioned as well, Dave Boy Mccauley, Wayne McCullough, again a true art warrior. And one thing I like about Wayne, he's my favorite Irish boxer growing up, because I was kind of the post Barry McGuigan era. My brother loved Barry. I was too young for Barry's peak, but Wayne was brilliant, and Wayne went out there in America and did it on his own, and went to Japan and fought for those WBC belts and won them. And I mean, it was a great kind of victory against all odds in those for a guy that didn't have much punching power, but he threw an unnatural amount of punches, and his nickname being the Pocket Rocket. Billy Conn, apart from the Lewis fight, not enough said about his career as a light heavy, and that's 2003. And he just says about Dave Boy Mccauley. Mccauley has the honour, along with Fidel Bassa, being voted Ring Magazine as the flyweight fight of 1980s. Pretty awesome for an Irish guy. Not to mention taking the IBF title fight from an informed Duke McKenzie, and his fights with Blanco are memorable. So there you go. So that's Marty's picks and tips. I would have said anyway were Wayne McCullough and Spinks. So they've been covered.
Yeah.
That
a bit of a fantasy fight. Could you imagine Wayne McCullough versus Zhu Khan?
That would be awesome. That would be
About
really...
1,000 punches around.
Do you reckon you get? I reckon you get 3,000 in that fight. 50
I mean, Jesus Christ, what's it? Pumpy Box would have its work cut out for it.
They'd be tapping the button every.
Yeah.
Frank wouldn't be able.
Honest to God.
I'm going to have to nip because the football's just kicked off. Very quickly, my preview for the weekend, Eubank points.
Okay.
With that.
That's
So
great.
I'm going to go with Eubank.
I hope that you're doing well for you there, Adam. I know you're Glasgow boy, so you'll support your own.
That'll be a no. That's the wrong part of Glasgow for me. Thank you.
I know very well. I'm only teasing. But, right, boys, just Adam's gone now. We're going to get a quick predict on the weekend. So what's your predictions on the weekend's matches?
Go on there, Michael. I'll let you go first.
Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, I think for me it's always been Eubank all the way. To be honest with you, I think boxing's always about levels. I feel like even though Eubank's fallen short on that world level, he's gone up those gears. He's gone those he's fought the Nick Blackwells at British level. He's fought the George Groves at world level. You know, Billy Joe went on to be a world champion. He's kind of had those tests, those acid tests, Eubank, and I think that's going to play a big part for this fight. However, you could also argue that Eubank's got 2 arms and 2 legs at the end of the day. There's also that big kind of weight, issue where Eubank's saying he's going to be at 60%, etc. Ben is going to be sharp in the early rounds, but for me, Ben's hasn't gone through the levels the Eubank has, and I think that's going to play a factor on Saturday. I think I don't know really what gives Ben the right to not kind of do the British title level, etc. He's gone straight to he's gone from the kind of journeyman level to the Samuel Vargas, to the Van Heerdens, to the Algeries, whatever way around you, and then now he's going straight with a solid middleweight in Eubank Jr. For me, I think it's too soon, too unrealistic for Ben to win this. I think he'll look sharp early, but ultimately Eubank will take over second half of the fight. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, and I hope to be there on Saturday. And again, I'm agreeing with everything you guys say. I just think Eubank's going to have A, too much experience, and B, too much weight. He's a man, and he's going to use his power against Ben. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, the work Tony Sims has done with Ben has brought him on greatly, but he's still not at the level that Eubank is. Even if Eubank was the same weight as him, Eubank has far more experience. So, I mean, I'm going for Eubank. I'm going for stoppage in the mid rounds for Eubank. That's where
I think Eubank should have his way with him, to be honest. A, Ben has never fought a puncher. B, he's never fought anyone at welterweight that was world level. Algeria was world level, light welterweight, not welterweight. And C, Eubank has a chin on him. He took fully fledged punches off George Groves, who was one of the bigger punches in the super middleweight division. If George Groves isn't going to put a dent in Eubank, neither Conor Ben's not either. I expect Ben to absolutely smash him up and do him in 4 or 5 rounds, to be honest.
Yeah. And briefly, we're going to head down to Australia. And Luke, you want to talk us through that one briefly?
Yeah. We'll go through the main event there. It's Sam Eggington.
Only the main event, please.
Yes. Sam Eggington is defending his IBO. Yeah. His IBO, isn't it? Yeah. And versus Dennis Hogan. Now, Dennis Hogan is a very underrated Irish boxer who a lot of people back home don't appreciate because he has had most of his career in Australia. Dennis Hogan very recently, a couple of years ago, fought Jaime Munguia for the light middleweight world title and was robbed. He beat Munguia from pillar to post that night and very clearly won in my eyes. I think Hogan is going to absolutely punch the head off Eggington. Eggington's there to be hit. Hogan's a classic puncher and very good boxer, and I think he's going to either stop him late or beat him on points wide.
Okay, Michael, have you a prediction on that, or have you not reviewed that?
I've got to be honest, guys. I haven't done my research, so I'll have to pay the fine jar for that one. But
that's fine. That's fine. Because
give it a watch.
I will give it a watch. I'll check in for sure. I actually like watching. Sorry, I just gonna say I do actually I enjoy watching Sam Egginton. He's always in good fights.
Sam,
he's always in a barnstormer.
Despite being a kind of glorified loser, if that's a bit harsh to say, but I think he is always in good fights. So.
His form of defense is his face,
Exactly.
If we're talking about overachievers, he is a major one.
Yeah,
for
sure.
He went in wanting to be a journeyman. That was his plan. He just wanted to be a journeyman and make a bit of money, and here he is, boxing on main events. Unbelievable.
Yeah. It's all relative, though. I mean, and he's a fighter that the crowd pleaser. So I mean,
if you go from being I want to be a journeyman to being a British champion, that's unbelievable. That's beyond your wildest dreams.
And he's fought former world champions, isn't he? Liam Smith.
Yeah,
he's fought Paulie Malignaggi. He beat Malignaggi.
The
gold medalist of Frankie Gavin.
Yeah, Jesus. That was a lovely body shot, actually.
With the Frenchman whose name escapes me now, but that was a phenomenal fight, on Channel 5, and I really enjoyed it, as much as
that was a brilliant fight.
He's kind of like the gatekeeper. If you want to do something in the game, you've got to beat a Sam Egginton, especially at that 154 division.
Just a fun fight, and I mean, I know the Aussies are going to absolutely love Sam Egginton Hogan. That's going to be a great fight, I think, in terms of, people just getting smashed, who's going to win? I can't say, if it goes to points, I reckon it'll be Egginton. If Hogan stops him, obviously he has won, but and he could, but that's where I am on that. And finally, now we're just going to mention Joe Cardina, and I'm going to go to Michael. What do you think of poor Joe Cardina's situation? Now,
yes,
sorry, I'll let you carry on. I didn't mean to influence you.
No, it's really disappointing, to be honest. As a Welshman, and obviously living in Cardiff, that I thought big fights were going to come to Cardiff quite soon, especially after the last him winning the world title at the Motorpoint Arena. Obviously, he was meant to make his first defense in the Middle East, which I wasn't overly pleased about. But good luck to him. Obviously, that's where the money was. He was offered a big opportunity. So at 30 years old, I don't blame Cardina for taking that fight, being involved in a big card. And that's probably where the most money was. However, so the news, obviously, he's been stripped from his world title due to an injury, a broken hand or whatever it was. And he will no longer be fighting Rachmanov, I believe his name is. Rachmanov. And there's rumours now that Rachmanov will be fighting for the vacant title against Alpha Barrett on that same undercard on the same evening.
Well, that's what Eddie wants to happen.
That's what Eddie wants to happen, okay.
Well, like now, I'm not saying Eddie wanted his chip, but that's how he managed to get Cardina his title shot, by agreeing he must defend within was it initially 60 days, and he did get one extension. So,
that's not an easy fight for Barrett.
No, it's not, but the winner...
Yeah, but if Hearn wants it to be the all-British clash, Barrett's really going to have to work for that world title.
Well, I don't know who Hearn wants, Cardina to face when the victor does emerge from that. But hopefully by that stage, Cardina will be fit and ready to go again, and the winner will be in place, and that fight can go ahead. Yeah. So it won't
just
be...
for me, sorry, Ed, but for me, the most disappointing thing is really I don't understand why the IBF couldn't have just made this, Rachmanov, this Barrett or something for an interim challenge, for an interim belt or whatever, and then the winner of that fights Cardina. I don't think there's really a big.
Well, I just
wrong, but I don't think there's a big cry for that super featherweight title to be defended.
Well, I think they could have waited. Cardina managed to skip the queue, by agreeing to this tight terms, and the IMF, or sorry, not the IMF, the IBF. The IMF were too busy chasing Liz Truss around London. The IBF kind of just put their foot down because, in fairness, Cardina did get an extension. And okay, Cardina is no longer the champion, but he does have the very next fight of the champion. So, while things look bad on paper, if he regains it...
Technically, he's the interim champion now.
Yeah. But that's just the way it goes. It is very harsh on him when you look at other organizations, but I don't think their behavior should be copied. I think...
Yeah, the IBF, in fairness, they stand their ground and they stand by their rules.
They're consistent.
Yeah. Yeah, with the exception of Spence, but then as I said, Spence has bought enough goodwill with the IBF. He's defended that title loads of times. Cardina hasn't defended it once, and there's a motor accident and all of that. But compared to like what the WBA are up to with their everybody gets a belt, you're the WB fucking A today champion, and you're the tomorrow champion, and you might fight, but if we like you can hold on to your belt forever, Leo Santa Cruz, hello. But
I just can't help but feel if he was a bigger household name, I think there would have been more leeway in this situation.
Well, what I would say is, had he been a champ for longer, had he defended that belt a few times, you know what I mean? But he didn't. I mean, that was his first fight. It was in the rule. It was in his contract. You get to skip the cube, but you must fight the guy that skipped.
Look, the best way Cardina can look at this is he gets the opportunity to become a 2-time champion.
Yeah.
That's the way he should be looking at it.
And he didn't lose his belt in the ring either. So,
exactly. So it doesn't matter.
He's still undefeated. So
yeah.
So he has all those positives going for him, and I don't know if he will get back to Wales, but that next title fight, I mean, I'm sure you could be looking at Cardiff City ground rather than the Motor Point for it.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great.
So there are those positives. Now, I do feel for Joe Cardina, absolutely, and I don't want to come across as being horrible, but I'm just saying, in terms of
it'll be a great chapter in the autobiography in a few years.
Absolutely, the IBF are at least being consistent, which is what we need, I think, in boxing a little bit more. Anyway, that's it, guys. So we're all going off to watch the end of Rangers.
Thanks very much, gents.
Or
enjoyed that.
For sure. I think if we had to put all of ours against each other, I'll take the bronze medal in that one. But all got their own stories
there, and I'm not going to start awarding out medals. I think all your picks. I mean, you came at it from very different angles, which I liked.
We did.
I mean, so you different kind of criterion as to why you picked as you picked. And what I liked about it was, like, some of your guys, I knew them from the 90s, and that was cool. And then obviously Luke has older ones. It's great, and the same with Stephen and Marty. I mean, they're great as well. And then Adam's ones as well. It just gives a flavour to the mix. And I was going to actually ask this and ask it of Adam as well. If you can put down your actual your picks into the comment section of this video.
100%. Yeah.
And then they can pick them apart, rather than kind of just, did who say that or did what say that? So if you can just do that, I would appreciate it. But I think fair play to you guys, your knowledge is brilliant. As I said, the guys I would have picked were mentioned by other people, and I knew they would be. But I mean, like, I don't have the breadth of knowledge you guys do, and it's great. And the one thing I'm going to do when I finish this video is find those fights that you've all tipped and watch them back, because if there's one thing I love about this boxing channel we've created, and
I'll throw them into the group chat and as well.
Brilliant! It's because it just gives me all these fights that are just so unbelievable. And I said, how come nobody mentions these? So it's brilliant. Anyway, thanks, guys. We'll see you next week when we'll be reviewing the Ben Eubank and Hogan Eggington fights, and we'll be looking forward to what's happening in the following week, which just escapes my mind at the moment. Anyway, take it easy, guys. Slán.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.
Right.